Hello everyone, this is a quick video then to talk you through the living world topic, and we'll do a little bit on cold environments as well. Okay, so you would use this obviously in your physical paper, so that'd be paper 1 of your GCSE. So if we're thinking about the living world, and of course we would talk about food webs and food chains and producers, and I've done all that already in the Epping Forest case study video, so I'm not going to duplicate that. So well worth you looking at that one and adding it to your watch list if you haven't done so already. But I'm going to talk first then about the nutrient cycle, something I think is really important before we move on. So the nutrient cycle is how nature is recycling nutrients within an ecosystem. Okay, and I always think really it's best to look at the nutrient cycle with 3 easy pictures. So in the biomass layer, I'm thinking, well, what's happening here with my tree? In my litter layer, I think about what's happening here with my leaf. You can see I've done GCSE art. And then in my soil layer, I'm just thinking about what's happening at ground level. So really, when I'm trying to get to here, my biomass layer, I'm thinking what's changing to get from soil to biomass. So to get from soil to biomass, well, the roots of my lovely tree here are taking up lots of nutrients then from the soil. So that's helping my tree grow nice and big. Autumn then comes, so my tree loses its leaves, so that's going to be littering. So they end up then as part of our litter layer, so sitting on top of the soil. At this point, we're going to get lots of rainfall, so that's an input into the system. So it's going to help to break down those leaves, and some of that water, that rainfall, will be lost to surface runoff. But what's left behind here in our litter layer is going to start to mulch down and it's going to decompose. So when it does that, those nutrients then are returned to the soil. Okay, we have one output here, so we lose some of those nutrients to leaching, so we can't keep everything in, but we get some nice weathered rock also to add into the soil. So then that whole cycle starts again. So our nice nutrient rich soil now, again, we'll have nutrients taken up by the roots, and our lovely big tree goes nice and strong again. That's all we've got happening here as part of the nutrient cycle. So in the exam, they might ask you to explain exactly what's happening here. Okay, and all you need to do is do it in a nice basic way that I've just done it there. So if you need to rewind that bit and watch it again to make sure you've got it in your head, please do. So if you move on from thinking about the nutrient cycle, the other big popular thing sometimes you like to ask about is this idea of global ecosystems. And that just means, well, where do we find these different biomes, so areas with certain characteristics around the world? And we focused in on a few in geography. So we've talked a lot about tropical rainforests. Okay, so in particular, we focused a little bit on Brazil. We talked a bit as well about Indonesian rainforests. That's our case study. So I'm not going to talk too much about rainforests because Indonesian rainforests will help you with that. We talk a little bit about polar and tundra environments. We thought about the characteristics that they have. So the second half of this video we'll talk about that. Okay, so it's just about knowing where are these different biomes. So could you pinpoint, for example, some of the desert areas there that I'm drawing arrows to? Would you know that in the exam? Would you know, for example, where you would find your temperate grassland or your Mediterranean environment? So again, it might just be worth pausing it and jotting down a couple of examples here, but you might just be asked to pinpoint something on a map in the exam. You might be asked to talk in a little bit more detail about these, so perhaps have a little think about, well, what would the weather line be like in certain environments here? And that links and follows on quite nicely, doesn't it, from that global atmospheric circulation model we did back in atmospheric hazards. We talked about what the weather would be like at different latitudes. Okay, so again, you can use that and pair that knowledge together. So we thought about the nutrient cycle. We've thought a bit about global ecosystems. We want to start thinking then about this idea of interdependence. Okay, interdependence is something that's talked about quite a lot in the exam. Okay, so if something is interdependent on something, well, it relies on something else. So if we think about what's interdependent within the tropical rainforest, we can almost make a bit of a list, can't we? So we can say, well, climate would be high up on that list. Alongside climate would be our plants, soil, I would put people on this list, a huge part of a rainforest. And I'd say animals too. So each of these 5 rely on or are in some way connected to the other. They are interdependent. Okay? So we think about perhaps how humans are interdependent on this ecosystem. Well, we might say, well, humans were to cut down the trees, or the soil wouldn't be protected, the rain would wash the nutrients away, so therefore the plants would struggle to grow. So it's having a knock-on effect on everything else because everything's linked, it relies on something else. Okay? We'll come back to this picture in a second. So let's take that idea of interdependence then and think about our layers of the rainforest. So you'll see I've already labelled these up for you. So you've got your forest floor, your under canopy, your canopy layer and your emergent layer. Okay, and each of these layers here have made sort of special adaptations, haven't they? So at the forest floor, you've got your buttress roots. Well, what are buttress roots? They're the nice roots that are quite wide at the bottom to enable our trees to reach the emergent layer to grow that tall. In your under canopy layer, you've got your lianas, so your woody vines that climb the trees to try and reach the sunlight. In your canopy layer, you've got your drip tip leaves, so they have a waxy surface and a funneled end to allow the water to run off them. And here in your emergent layer, it's your nice tall trees. So they've adapted, they've had to grow tall enough to be able to reach the sunlight. So in the same way we've annotated on here adaptations of plants, animals also have had to make changes too. So they have to camouflage to hide from predators. They need to be able to have a short wingspan to fly between trees. Some are nocturnal, so they might feed at night to save energy or have a sharp sense of smell then to cope with a dark forest floor. So they've all made adaptations or changes to be able to cope with this environment. So that Indonesian rainforest video really going to help you out here, okay? And again, I would suggest perhaps watching that one and using that as part of your revision because I'll talk more there about deforestation and the impacts that's having. Really crucial stuff for the exam. So if we go back then up to this picture at the top where we were, we said, well, interdependence means that everything relies on each other. Okay, and that's what gives some of our tropical rainforests value. So the value of our rainforests could be things like, well, they're the source of many products or medicines. So we still might have some undiscovered medicines or products there that we're not aware of, and that's why they're incredibly valuable to us. If we think about the idea of people, well, sustainable development here might give us long-term economic benefits. So things like ecotourism, for example, is one huge opportunity. Our rainforests, really important, are helping to reduce the greenhouse effect, so they're absorbing that CO2 for us. So deforestation threatens that massively. They're helping also to regulate our climate and our water cycle. So again, if we do have things like deforestation, well, that increases the risk for us then of things like having droughts or having flooding. Okay, hence that interdependence and the value for us is exceptionally high. So because of that, we need to have management strategies. Okay, I would say, well, there are sort of 7 main management strategies here that are super important for us. So let's annotate these on as we go, shall we? So management strategy number 1 that I'd say is super important is replanting. Okay, so if we're replanting, we're putting in new trees of the same type then to replace the ones that have been chopped down. So for some countries, this is like a legal requirement for logging companies. So if we've talked briefly about logging, let's add that in then as the next bit of management. So you can do what's called selective logging. Okay, let me explain what that is. So selective logging means you choose which trees then you're chopping down. Okay, so you might choose them from, for example, a variety of ages. Or doing this then helps our forest to regenerate. Okay, you're not completely wiping out an area, you're only taking a small proportion. We talked about people before, didn't we? Our next method of management, we could say, is ecotourism. So you're having small groups of tourists follow really strict environmental rules. So you'd hire the local people, so that would take them away from things like mining or logging for income, because it would employ them in tourism. And it also gives them an incentive then to conserve the environment. It's putting them in charge of it. So that leads us nicely on to our next method. So that would be education. So encourage sustainable product use. Teach local people how they can make money in an environmentally friendly way. Through things like ecotourism would support that. Conservation then would be our next management method. So conservation, so things like natural parks or nature reserves. So restricting the damaging activities you're doing there. And countries then can set up funds. Okay, so overseas investors might well donate to protect those areas as well. We might also want to consider here reducing debt as well. Let me explain what I mean by that. So we could cancel debt, so potentially debt with other countries, so that countries don't have to log or farm to repay it. So you can do a conservation swap. So a country's debt could be paid off then if conservation is guaranteed. And last but not least then, let's add this one on, it's perhaps the longest one. So international hardwood agreements. There we go. So those help to prevent illegal logging and promote the use of hardwood. So that would be from sustainably managed forests rather than taking it from anywhere. Okay, so if we sort of zoom out and get the bigger picture, I know this is a whistle-stop tour, but most of it's covered in the case study videos, so I didn't want to duplicate for you. So we've covered all of that. So last bit we'll finish off by doing, we had a sneak preview earlier, is we'll talk then about cold environments. Okay, and again I've covered this in the Alaska video, so we'll try and keep this one nice and brief. So the big thing you need to know here about cold environments is the difference between then your polar and tundra environments. So if we look at my two photographs here, let's label this up. So picture number 1 here, that's going to be our polar environment. Picture number 2 here, it's going to be our tundra environment. So in the exam, you would need to know the difference between these two. So let's bullet point a few ideas on then, shall we? So we can start thinking about the climate to start with. So in polar environments, typically very cold environment, okay, low precipitation as well. So precipitation is any form of moisture, not just rainfall. In our tundra environment, pretty similar. Okay, so again, also cold, okay, low levels of precipitation. There we go, let's add that one on. Let's think about the plants then. So in polar environments, sort of clue in the picture really, we're getting very few plants, okay, mostly sort of mosses or grasses, potentially on the coast. If we think about tundra environments, here we can see that plant life is slightly more abundant. So here we're getting some shrubs, so those we can see in the picture. We've got some grasses, some mosses as well. If we think sort of average temperature, well, polar is reaching minus 90 degrees. Tundra here is about minus 50 degrees. I guess that might account for the difference in plant species. Again, we think about people and how people play a role in this environment. So polar here, mostly we could say uninhabited. We think about tundra environments. Again, you might get your oil and gas workers here. Indigenous people as well. So that impacts them on sort of environment and the plants, okay, people, climate. So again, bringing it back to that idea of interdependence, things being reliant on each other. So in these two environments, unfortunately, what we're starting to get here is very low biodiversity. Okay, let's annotate that on. So you've got very low biodiversity here. So a change in one species could affect all dependent species. So global warming here is also going to play a bit of a role, isn't it? Okay, and we'll talk more about what we mean by that in a second. So a bit like we talked about in the rainforest, our plants and animals here are also having to make changes. They're having to adapt. If we start thinking about our plants first, well, typically they've got a short growing season. So level of sunlight would impact on that massively. They've normally got small leaves. So if we look at my lovely plant here, it definitely has that. So small leaves here are going to help limit transpiration. They've got shallow roots. Okay, and that's because of the permafrost. They're sort of low-lying. Okay, so that would help protect them from the wind. And many plants here become dormant, so help them survive the cold and dark winters as well. So let's compare that then to animals. So we'll take the classic polar bear here. Well, the fur here is going to help keep that polar bear nice and warm. Animals also might hibernate. We've got animals that are hibernating, helps them to conserve energy. They might also migrate, so they might move to warmer areas to help with the adverse temperature. Here we've got the nice white coat, haven't we? That's also helping with camouflage. Okay, so it might help them avoid predators, but also might help them stalk other animals as well, so help them with hunting. So both mutually beneficial. Okay, so your big case study then of a cold environment, in case you've forgotten, that would be Alaska. So let me write that one on here for you. So Alaska's got loads of opportunities and challenges because of all of this development as well. Okay, so I'd now strongly encourage you to have a look at the Alaska video, because that would be your case study for this side of the course. And as ever, if you've got questions, go and see your geography teacher.